What is going on, ladies and gentlemen? Tonight on stream, we'll be reacting to John Doyle's MLK video, the long-awaited one. Now, I was debating of whether or not we should even still do this because we had this planned earlier in the week and he didn't post it, but he posted it now. But I really thought about this and I was like, left-wing breadtube is going to have a field day with this video. I thought to myself, actual Jake, maybe even Vosh and all those left-wing stream tuber people, they're going to have a field day with this, okay? They're going to be making all their cringe reaction videos, and whenever you search up John Doyle, all you're going to get is John Doyle racist, makes racist video, and then this stupid idiot is going to just be reacting to it. And he's just, so, I thought about, I was like, we as conservatives, we as the Doyle heads, the HOC enthusiasts, we need to really rally the troops here. Okay. We need to circle the wagons. We need to get our own version of left-wing bread tube set up, except it'll be right-wing bread tube. And I guess it wouldn't be bread tube, wasn't it? Because we don't eat bread, right? We don't eat bread. We eat meat. So that's what it'll be. We're calling it meat tube or steak tube. I don't know. We'll come up with that name in a second. But this is the MLK video, folks, okay? The long-awaited one. And I will say that this is a topic that I think is underrated in terms of its importance. And, I talked about this a little bit on MLK Day. And obviously earlier on stream this week, we talked about this. We read some of Sam Francis's piece on this that he wrote back in the 80s or 90s. But really, the MLK pill is something that I think a lot of conservatives are just simply not willing to take. I think it's also important to point out why it's important to actually take the MLK pill, because, many might say, well, I don't see what the big deal is. Well, because here is basically the dichotomy that you have surrounding MLK when it comes to the American political scene. Both the left and the right basically deify this guy, right? They basically prop him up to the level arguably beyond the founding fathers, right? I would argue MLK is basically more infallible in American life than I would say both the founding fathers, and I'd even go so far as to say I think he's seen as more infallible than Jesus, right? Now, the issue I see, and we'll start the video in a second, so don't go anywhere, but the issue I really see is that the truth here is actually on the side of the left, okay? And that's not something I often say, but I think it's something that's actually true. When you really break down MLK, his legacy, who he was, what he believes, the truth is, contrary to what you're told by the mainstream conservative talking points, the truth is MLK would have been a staunch supporter of every single left-wing social and economic cause that you see today. That is the truth. And this video is going to talk about it, and we'll talk about it in a little bit more. But obviously, and this is exactly what the left uses MLK for, right? And I think there are many grounds to be had by this. You look at MLK back in the day; he supported every single left-wing political cause back in his day, and it went far beyond just being colorblind or content of character or whatever. I mean, every single left-wing cause he was behind. He was very friendly to communist and socialist groups in the country. As John brings up in this video, he literally had a communist speechwriter. Okay, a communist wrote his speeches, including the "I Have a Dream" speech. So someone who's very friendly to communists, which immediately you ought to be asking this question: is this guy really like the closet conservative guy that we think he is today? And you also look at all of the legacy that he left behind, right? MLK mentored people like Jesse Jackson, right? And we all know the story with Jesse Jackson. That's obviously we see his politics today. All of MLK's kids, okay, are very, very hard leftists as well. And the organizations that he left, but every legacy that he left behind today is now an agent of the far left. It's literally everything that we as conservatives oppose. But we seem to have this grand conspiracy theory that actually MLK was basically just today's colorblind conservative, and that's just not the truth. And the issue I have is that you have these. Let me actually change size up so you can see. Okay, you have these two realms of thought, right, surrounding MLK, but they both prop him up, right? They both prop him up to deity status, and that's what he is in America. He's a deity. You can barely question the guy. It's very controversial to even say anything bad about him. And it's so on one hand, you have the left. Let me see. Now this is your left side. So you have the left, right, which sees him as exactly what he was, right? A very hard left activist, right, of his day, and basically his legacy is the modern left-wing movement. Okay, but you have the right who thinks his entire legacy was basically just the "I Have a Dream" speech, and he was like a colorblind American patriot or whatever. Okay, but here's the issue I have, right, is that both sides are basically acknowledging that this guy is this amazing deity. The issue is that you know, when people really research the truth into MLK and they find out, you know, you really break down like the truth about MLK, he was way more so what the left, sorry, this side, what the left thinks that he was than what the right thinks that he was. But the issue is what the right is still doing is basically propping him up to the status of like American deity, like this extra founding father, arguably even beyond the founding fathers. And it's like, you know, once, so even if someone at initially buys the MLK talking point, the way the right views MLK, right, inevitably they're going to look more so. I mean, someone's going to like look more so and really discover the truth about MLK. And then when you discover the truth, you discover that he was a pretty hardcore leftist. The issue is conservatives have already seeded the ground that like MLK is this deity, right? MLK is like this amazing figure. He's like another founding father that you can't question. The conservative mainstream already concedes this. And once they do that, all you have to do is find out the truth about MLK. And if it's already in your head that like, hey, this is this amazing guy, let me follow everything he does, then the pipeline to leftism is very easy. It's very quick. It's very easy to understand. But my point in saying that is that what conservatives need to do is simply stop propping the guy up as a deity. Because even if we try to rewrite his legacy, the truth is it's dishonest, first of all. So it's not, but also it's very easily disprovable. And so if we still prop him up, but try to change his legacy, ultimately in the end, his true legacy is going to come out. And when his true legacy comes out, that's a huge case for the left. What we need to do as conservatives is simply not prop the guy up, right? Simply tell the truth about the guy and explain like why this is a guy who's not on our side. And ultimately, I think that is like the way we need to go about this. And that's the way we kind of, I don't know, at least take back a little bit of the ground that we've ceded on this huge issue. But with that being said, I'll stop talking because I know everyone's really here for Doyle. So I'll give more thoughts as we go along. But that's kind of my initial premise here. And again, this is a guy who, like I said, would have supported every like left-wing cause of today. I mean, that is simply the truth. So let's take a look here. So here we go. Noah Boyd said, it has come to my attention that a girl is above me in the mod hierarchy. This needs to change. I need a wrench. Thank you for the $10. Okay, Noah, I'll give you a wrench. So I can't do it on StreamYard right now. So if another mod can do it, go ahead. If not, I'll do it afterward or something. Okay, just remind me. But all right. Let's start this video, folks.
It is that time of year, folks. Black History Month is here. And of course, we just had Martin Luther King Jr. Day, which is a federal holiday, one of 11 federal holidays, and one of only 2 federal holidays to be dedicated to an American historical figure. And this is so important to discuss for so many reasons, because if you look at the calendar, you'll see that the only other American historical figure to have their own day is George Washington, the man who led the Continental Army in the Revolutionary War to defeat what was at the time the greatest military force in the history of the world, the British Empire.
Should I slow it down? I actually have it sped up so it'll go faster, but we'll speed it. We'll slow it down until we get tired of it, and then we'll keep going. All right.
Elected to be the first president of our country, and whose presidency would go on to be one of the most successful and influential presidencies in the history of our country in terms of guiding future attitudes and policy. Arguably the most significant man in American history. And for that, we give him one day. And then equally represented on the calendar with one day as well is Martin Luther King Jr., who was regarded as the figurehead and martyr of the civil rights movement. And so the easy thing to do would be to say, you know, George Washington is all these good things, and Martin Luther King is a serial adulterer and communist and plagiarist.
John already talks fast. It is so true. It is simply true.
Structure American society, which is all true. I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm forgetting that this is the first time that many of us are hearing this. And so this is supposed to be the introduction to the MLK pill, kind of understanding the truth about this person and what their legacy actually is. And so that's what we're going to actually do today, because to just start opening cans of worms about moral character would start to call into question bad things that Washington did as well. And this is, of course, the Beatty principle of canonical inclusion, which is essentially that...
Is it echoing? All right, hold on.
Every historical figure who is worth
I don't even know if
about
my AirPods have battery, though. That's the problem.
In contemporary America fired. So I'm much more concerned about the legacy and impact than I am the character, because obviously historical figures should be measured by their legacies and impacts, right? Like that's kind of the whole point. So it is funny, though, because, you know, when criticizing our heroes, the left always tries to paint them in a bad light to discredit their legacies and their accomplishments. But when we criticize their heroes, it's because their legacies and their accomplishments suck. Like, they're worth criticizing. Like, you can't tell me that George Washington didn't actually lead the Continental Army. But Martin Luther King did actually plagiarize his PhD dissertation. And he was actually propped up by the elites in this country, which does call into question this whole, oh, brilliant mind that was just speaking truth to power, that whole characterization. And it's funny, too, because we've never claimed that our heroes are necessarily good people. We say that they're great people because they've done great things. But the left's heroes haven't done great things, and so they always prop them up.
And that's the other thing, like I mentioned, is it not? John Doyle. I was about to say John Doyle has been propped up to the status of a founding father, which Okay, is arguably true. I actually think that's based. I actually think my Freudian slip, I think my gaffe there was about to be incredibly based. I mean, it's so true. There's a reason why I commented on this video. My comment was John Doyle is MLK. Like that was actually my comment. And obviously, you know, many would perceive it's something that's meant to be tongue in cheek. It's arguably meant to kind of mock the deification of MLK, to like make it kind of like make it very unserious, make it kind of funny. No, the truth is that's exactly what I meant. And I didn't mean that because John Doyle is a left-wing activist or an adulterer or whatever. No, it is actually the fact that John Doyle will ascend the status of the founding fathers, and it's very true. It's very true. This is a no one will take this into account until it's done, but it's very true.
As these revolutionaries, as these whatever, and in actuality, the case is that they're terrible people and they have terrible legacies. But you can't say that. You know, George Washington possessed a powerful spirit and a brilliant strategic mind, and it led to the establishment of this great country. But he enslaves. Yeah. Martin Luther King was a peaceful genius who led a revolution against a system of white supremacy. Virtually everything that you just said is incorrect. And then they just kind of short circuit. So think about that, though. You know, the left celebrates Martin Luther King Jr. as an American hero. They use him in their advertising and promotion for all their racial politics, Black Lives Matter, critical race theory, reparations, police abolition, etc. What does the right do? The right says, no, you fools. This is not what Martin Luther King wanted. He didn't support violence. He didn't support race-based policy. He wanted everyone to be judged by the content of their character. He was a Republican. He liked guns. He was a Christian. You guys are ruining his legacy. No, actually, they are his legacy. Martin Luther King Jr.'s legacy is Black Lives Matter, critical race theory, reparations, all of it. He would have supported all of it, and I can prove that to you. So be sure to watch all the way through.
It's so true. It's actually so true. Actually, here's one thing I did want to kind of point out. Here's a very, I think, easy analogy so that everyone can like really understand it. Okay, so because like I said, the kind of conservative accepted realm of thought is that, you know, MLK's legacy is the I Have a Dream speech. Let me ask you this question. Who else do you apply that to where their entire legacy is like this, you know, this one speech, like their most optical, uniting, feel-good speech, and that's their entire legacy? Like, okay, let me ask you this question though. Can we apply that to other things? And let me, again, put this in a way that's very easy for like everyone who's conservative to understand. Remember Joe Biden's inauguration speech? Okay, remember that? Remember how, I don't remember exactly how it went, but it was kind of supposed to be this like feel good unity speech about, you know, we're going to unite the country or whatever. And it's like, how would you feel if someone looked at that speech and said, this is Joe Biden's legacy. This right here is all Joe Biden's about. This is entire like political and social and moral legacy. And that's it. It's this one big speech that he gave that was like this feel-good speech. How would you as a conservative respond to that? You would look at that and be like, what the heck? That's ridiculous. Obviously he has all this other stuff to him. Like, that's just not true, right? Would you not say that? Would you not look at that and be like, no, it's not just one speech. You have to look at what he stood for, what he did. You know, just because he was giving a feel-good speech to like a general audience in the country doesn't mean Joe Biden was ever about unity or like patriotism or anything like that. He's the opposite of all those things. But it's like, okay, if that's how you would feel about someone standing up and saying that, like, well, Joe Biden's legacy is his inauguration speech, why are you like basically going to just frame MLK's legacy as being like the I Have a Dream speech? And who else do we do this for in American history? You know, like even like the founding fathers and stuff, when we study them, like we actually break down what they believe and stuff. You know, we talk about, you know, Jefferson had this vision. He had like the agrarian vision of a future of American democracy. Hamilton was more of like the aristocratic, cities-based kind of like national. You could argue in many ways he's sort of like this national conservative figure, but like when we debate the founding fathers, we do these things. We talk about their ideas. We don't just talk about Washington's inaugural address or whatever. Even like Lincoln, we don't just talk about the Gettysburg Address. We talk about his whole legacy. So why is it exactly that we have to narrow down MLK to this one single speech? And the answer is because when you go outside of like this one single speech, immediately what you end up realizing is, hey, this guy was a pretty hard leftist, but we can't do that, right? So, because we can't prop up his ideology because it doesn't agree with us. We can't prop up his morality either, by the way. Because that's probably the other angle. It's like, yeah, MLK was a leftist, but it's not about his politics. It's about like the celebration of like a good moral man. The issue is MLK was not a good moral man either, right? He was a serial adulterer. Okay, he was arguably a rapist, right? This is kind of either that or he enabled rape, right? There's a lot of evidence there. Okay, he, in terms of his Christianity, which has been celebrated by a lot of like, you know, Christian churches and stuff in America. I think even like some Baptist churches and whatnot. Like in terms of his Christianity, He was basically something of a heretic. You know, he didn't believe that Jesus Christ was the Son of God, to my understanding. I don't remember his exact theological views, but I did research this, and you can look this up. Like, MLK was basically a heretic when it came to Christianity. He believed in like a lot of these like weird cultish beliefs. So I wasn't even really a Christian either. He was not just a good person in general. So you can't do that either. So all conservatives have is like this one single speech, and it's like, why? And like I said, inevitably people are going to just kind of like research what MLK was about, and inevitably they're going to realize, hey, the conservatives are wrong here. MLK was a pretty hard leftist, but if the conservatives say that MLK was a good guy, I guess he was a good guy. I guess all this stuff should be, you know, taken as it is. And it's like, you see the problem there? Okay. All right.
Your rebuttals, which were all taught to you in public school by liberal teachers when you were very young. And this was all done intentionally, of course. In other words, if you are pro MLK and think that he is a good figure in American history and that he wouldn't support everything that's happening now in terms of the racial politics, then you especially need to listen, because this is just information that you clearly haven't heard yet. You ever think about that? Do you ever think about why the schools, which you know are run by the left, had you singing songs about this guy when you were very young? It's all conditioning. I never sang one song about a founding father in elementary school, but we had assemblies every year. We had the peace march around the school. Everyone was made to learn that this guy was a hero. And it was all very fun. The whole process, you know, we're singing, we're dancing. We got to
That's true. He was.
The whole thing. Why? Because you have to believe that this guy
was not
a hero
like the based Christian that you think he
was,
was, you know,
the parameters of the discussion. Everyone is conditioned to agree that this guy's a hero. That's not up for debate. The debate is, well, was he a hero in this way, like the left says, or this way, like the right says? Who else is like that in American history? Where you can only agree that they're a hero. Why is it only him? This is why a lot of you are anxious right now. Like, are you sure we can criticize this guy? Surely he's a hero, isn't he? That's why they get you when you're young. They can literally program you to have an emotional response to criticism of someone that you were taught to idolize as a child. They do the same thing in North Korea, literally, the singing, the dancing, all of it, the stories. But there's a reason that this man has equal representation to George Washington on the calendar in this country. Talk about equality of outcome. And it's because if George Washington is the figure who represents the founding of this country, its constitution, what it stood for, etc., then Martin Luther King is the figure who represents the legal enshrinement of its antithesis through the changes in federal law that were a result of the civil rights movement.
True. He is kind of like the anti-founding father. It's very true.
Martin Luther King represents the enforcement of equality of outcome. If George Washington represents God-given rights, then Martin Luther King represents civil rights, which in case you didn't know are defined as the rights of citizens to political and social freedom and equality, which we basically already had. Doesn't that sound familiar though? Aren't we still like hearing this every day in this country? It's almost as if nothing actually has changed. And that's because it hasn't. I mean, nothing changes. Nothing ever does. Time is a flat circle. It was never about justice. It was always about paving the way with good intentions, of course, to the destruction of our country. And that's why it has to be a federal holiday. That's why this guy has to be elevated to the level of George Washington, because even though he wasn't even like an exceptional guy, I mean, he wasn't that smart. He was totally propped up. His legacy, his story, the myth of Martin Luther King Jr., the martyr, the man who was just tired of being picked on for no other reason than his skin was dark. He was killed for wanting equality. That's necessary to drill into the consciousness of the American people in order to justify everything that has happened since then, which is why if you're even allowed to criticize racial politics in this country or anything adjacent to it, which in 99% of cases you aren't, you can only make the argument that, well, maybe we should just go back to what our teachers taught us MLK was all about. Maybe we should go back to an earlier stage of liberalism and then scratch your heads why it inevitably leads to this point again. I feel so badly for these people. You know, they've watched their country completely transform, and they're looking at the diversity quotas and the reparations and the anti-white racism, the affirmative action, and they're like, well, how did all this happen? It's because of the civil rights movement. That's what started all of this, broadly speaking. And I'm not trying to say the civil rights movement, by the way, didn't have some legitimate grievances. I'm not saying that we should just like undo the whole thing. People are going to interpret it that way because they want to paint me in a bad light because they're dishonest. But I'm just here to point out how everything is just basically repeating itself.
No, they're not. It's very true.
So after you're done watching this, I would encourage you to do your own research and then make up your own mind from there. But now we will go over the popular history of Martin Luther King that we're all taught, why it's not true, what the actual history of Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement is, why he was actually assassinated, and how this predictably has led us to the state of current American politics and government and culture. So do stay tuned.
All right, do people want us to slow it down? We can slow it down. We can slow it down. Hold on. There, it's back to normal speed.
Hello there, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Heck Off Commie.
Well, see, I'll slow it down for the
feels
important
good.
parts, and then like
the first thing I want to do
that we can like summarize, we'll speed it up. I think that's good strategy here. I think that's good optics.
Though is explain this shirt here to you guys, because it does really tie into exactly what we're talking about today. And some of you might remember this because a few months ago we debuted the concept during a rant about Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement, which of course is the concept of the George Floyd conservative.
He says not.
It's making
Carter doesn't know what he wants.
Tendency the conservatives
he does not know what he wants.
Idolize earlier stages of liberalism.
I wish John
this like naive nostalgia for a time when the country was just beginning its decline, because they don't really understand that the earlier stages formed the riverbeds for what we're seeing now. And so I'll play the clip for you now, and then we will continue. Number 4, this is too far. We need to go back to insert previous stage of liberalism that was predicted.
So
to
true.
lead to this.
I'll skip this part because I can reasonably summarize it. Okay, I think I can reasonably summarize what he said or is going to say. So, and I'll add to it by saying that I think that conservatives are slowly starting to wake up to the whole slippery slope thing. I mean, it's probably like decades too late, but I think conservatives in many ways now see in like to an extent to which, at least I would say the most you see the needle moving is like on the LGBT thing, right? A lot of and I'm going to say a lot because there's still a lot who don't get this, but there are increasing number of conservatives now who look at like the LGBT and the way like that movement has gotten so radical and so crazy and has so much power. And there's some, not a huge, but there's some who look back on it and say, well, maybe this all started because of like the gay marriage stuff and whatnot. Like maybe the reason why it's gotten to this point is because we allowed the slippery slope to come in through like more initially moderate ends. Okay. Now, I think when it comes to issues like, BLM or whatever, or feminism, whatever, I still think to a large extent, most conservatives are having a hard time really conceptualizing like, hey, this is the same principle. This is the same like slippery slope of liberal causes that there is. But, of course, right. Of course, hopefully as time progresses, as you kind of realize things get worse and worse, hopefully maybe conservatives will realize this. But I have concerns at the same time because I think a lot of conservatives sort of just stop and look at this, and they do exactly what John kind of teased, which is just saying, hey, can we please return to an earlier stage of liberalism, right? It's like, can we just return when they were able to marry, or at least, men and women were in the same, propped up in the same kind of like societal sense, and even beyond that. But can we just go back to that? And now, not what this is now. It's like, no. Like one inevitably leads to another. Like John says, it's so true. All we're talking about is simply earlier stages of liberalism. Now, the final boss, almost, I would say the final boss of this is kind of realizing that MLK and, that is the logical predecessor, and is it is indeed the predecessor to modern kind of, movements like BLM, CRT, all these things. But we'll see. Hopefully this video can point that out to some people. Well, let's take a look.
And it's so true. I mean, what we're seeing right now is just history repeating itself, and we're living through it. And it really is amazing to try to kind of step back and view it objectively, because when you start to do that, you start to ask yourself questions. We like asking questions, right? We want to arrive at the truth, right? So you look at the way that these activists are.
And it's so true, right? It's so true. There's a reason they tell you the slippery slope is a logical fallacy. The slippery slope literally is true. It's not a fallacy whatsoever. It's simply like true. Okay. But you're right. And your professor, this is one of the first things you're taught in like AP Lang and stuff and whatnot. And when you learn about logical fallacies, you're taught the slippery slope is a logical fallacy. It's only a logical fallacy if you don't use your logic. Okay. Because logic suggests, hey, one thing does lead to another. If this is their end goal and they're going to work towards their end goal by this increment, the slippery slope absolutely is true. But that's exactly it. Okay. I think one of the big reasons why you're taught by liberal education that it is a fallacy is precisely because it is something that is like very often most commonly weaponized by liberal institutions in America. It is so true. It is simply so true. Jennifer says a ball only rolls downhill 100% of the time. It is very true. Very good way to put it. Very good way to put it.
Now, how they burn down and destroy your cities, and how the media covers for them and says that they're just peaceful protests. And maybe you start to wonder how those same narratives in the media and public education system, which is controlled by communists, those same narratives told you that the civil rights movement, well, those demonstrations were peaceful. And MLK was all about peace. And the footage and the stories about the race riots, well, that was because of police brutality and racism. And even MLK, by the way, said riots are the language of the unheard. But those riots were okay, right? It's these ones that are all of a sudden bad, right? And even those
but that's not what he meant. Like he didn't mean BLM.
He did, though. Right?
He did.
And you start to look at how they're saying the same things now about the rioting and the looting, and the media is totally covering for them. Virtually every institution in the country covers for them. And you have to wonder when the switch occurred, right? Because according to the way the right perceives history, or tends to at least, with the civil rights movement, there was a point everyone stopped being racist. They'll say, well, of course racism used to exist in this country, but not anymore. And yet these activists are still rioting, they're still looting, and they're saying the same things now that they were 60 years ago, which we'll get into in more detail as we continue. But my question is, are you actually willing to throw your grandparents and your great-grandparents under the bus and claim that you know better than them and that you are a better person than them? even ignoring the fact that the ratio of black imprisonment is worse now than back then, home ownership, intact family rate, et cetera, et cetera. Like there's literally no metric to suggest that black America is better now than it was 60 years ago, but we're told still that we have to keep making progress. Even ignoring that all of these policies that have been implemented by the federal government have been complete and total failures, the right likes to get their good boy points. They like to say, well, of course there was racism and of course there was police brutality, but not anymore. Now it's just a handful of bad apples. How do you know that though? That's what your schools taught you. And the schools in the future are going to teach your kids the current and updated leftist narratives in addition to the ones that you were taught. Schools in the future are going to teach your children and your grandchildren about Trayvon Martin, about Michael Brown. These are the cases which were both completely justified when you look at the evidence, you actually examine it objectively.
It's so true. Like you look at the way that, you know, the civil rights movement is painted nowadays in, you know, liberal education and mainstream public education. And you're just like, well, you know, whatever, right? But then have you ever, you know, do you really consider the fact that when you look at the people who are writing the curriculum now, and by the way, you know, I've had this experience too in terms of history teachers, English teachers, professors too. You know, I had it in high school, you can still see it in college, which is the fact that if you ever notice, you know, let's think about your English teachers for a second, okay? High schoolers can maybe relate to this, even like college kids, maybe you can relate to this. Think about your younger teachers versus your older teachers. Like you'd have older teachers who are very liberal, progressive, whatever, but then you notice how much more aggressive on average, I'm stereotyping, but I'm sure many of you guys had this experience. If you ever had an English teacher or history teacher, like right out of college, right out of school, they are aggressively far more progressive, far harder to the left than your older teachers. And that's to say the new generation coming out of academia nowadays is, and just conceptualize this, understand this, realize this, way crazier than like, you know, the teachers you have to deal with now. So you compound that with the fact that, you know, the way that BLM and stuff is being talked about now, imagine what the narratives will be surrounding what's happening now for your children, for your grandchildren. Okay. It's so true. It's so true. BLM is going to be put on the same pedestal, and CRT is the same pedestal as MLK and the civil rights movement is now, if not a higher one. And it's
I'm
very
7
true.
years old. Even I know better than that. And that's how it's taught to us. That's how it was taught to me. That's how it was taught to you. And it was even taught to me by my music teacher, who upon recollection had short hair, was kind of overweight, didn't have a wedding ring. This woman literally gave us the majority of our civil rights education, which was, of course, it was a music teacher. White people,
so true.
Well, they thought black people were subhuman because of the color of their skin, and Martin Luther King Jr. was a brave hero speaking truth to power, and he was inspired by Rosa Parks, another brave hero who was resisting power. Now we all know better, and they teach you this when you're a child. Your mind is very malleable and impressionable. You don't question a whole lot. What do we always say? The iron law of propaganda is that the earlier you start, the less it has to make sense, because like we said earlier, their whole agenda only works if you at least believe that the civil rights movement was good.
And that's how we were taught in school. I guarantee you the way MLK is being taught today is
educating the future generations.
Different, right? They're probably
conceding on the most important point, which is that the
history
civil
than
rights
just saying he was like this
which
figure of
implies
peace.
that this country was deeply racist and oppressive and in need of total reform. And that is what has led to everything else that we're seeing.
If you
now.
have young siblings in school, ask them how MLK is being taught. It's probably not even the way we're being taught.
And again, this is not to say that the civil rights movement did not have some legitimate points. This is not to say that there was no racism or that we should bring back Jim Crow. I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is that I will not betray my family to play into your arbitrary moral framework. If you are conceding that racism used to exist back then, but not now, that is what leads to where we are now, because it justifies the actions taken by them. If you ask your grandpa in the 1960s if he judges people by the color of their skin, he'd say, no, it's not about skin color. It's because groups behave differently and cultures behave differently, right? Is he right or is he wrong? Because if you make the same claim now, if you say, well, groups behave differently, cultures behave differently, guess what they call you? A racist, because nothing ever changes and time is a flat circle. It's the same set of problems now that it was back then. The behavior by the activists is the same. The rhetoric from them is the same. You'd be a racist back then, and they're going to write the books that you're a racist now. Their demands are the same. The media, the institutions, they're still running defense for them. That's the same. And they won't acknowledge this because they need you to think that previous generations were just evil. Like every leftist thinks that their grandparents are Calvin Candy. They go to Thanksgiving dinner and politics comes up, and their grandpa just says something like, you know, Black Lives Matter should really stop burning down cities and looting. And they just start hallucinating their grandpa just producing a skull like, what is he, his old George? Now, if you examine this piece of skull, you will find 3 distinct dimples, because this is what they do. This is how they justify everything that they do. People back then were stupid.
My grandparents are epic.
Now. We're progressive.
Don't
now.
attack
this is their
them.
entire concept of what history is. It's not cyclical. It doesn't repeat. We're just always making progress. And the timeline is basically that everything up until the birth of Christ, that was chaos. There was nothing good. It was only pain and suffering, just completely and utterly evil, not even anything approximating a proper level of diversity and inclusion and equity. And then Christ is born. And then from there until about 1939, Handmaid's Tale. Everything is oppressive. Everything is just power dynamic with white men at the top. Women are sex slaves. White men are responsible for everything bad. And then in 1939, we're introduced to a man with a funny mustache who was ostensibly the final boss. And that went on for about 6 years. And then we were making so much progress towards diversity and equity and inclusion. But then in 2015, you know how like in old slasher movies, the killer always jumps back up like one last time, like, you know, in Friday the 13th with the canoe. That's basically what happened with Donald Trump. You know, he rallies the racists and the fascists and the homophobes and the sexists and the transphobes. And they were all up against the resistance, up against Dumbledore's army. And then evil was finally defeated. And now we're living through the only remotely righteous time in the history of human existence. It's only right now where we have our democracy and accountability and equity. This is literally.
Here's the thing, though. That's not just the view of American world history from the left-wing perspective. I think, honestly, if anything, I would argue that's actually not even the left-wing perspective necessarily. It is even more so the like mainstream conservative, quote unquote, perspective. Is that not it? Because every conservative debate I ever heard growing up, like listening to like the mainstream conservative organizations, was basically predicated around, you know, America was founded on good ideals, but up until like 10 years ago, you know, we never really fully lived up to those ideals, but it's only like right now. And so now we finally hit it where, you know, now this is countries open for everyone and this and that, and our ideals extend to everyone. But it's like, yeah, everyone before us, yeah, they were evil and racist. And it's like, and this is what you would hear self-proclaimed conservatives saying. Honestly, when I was younger, I probably said and thought a lot of nonsense like this too. But really ask yourself, is that a conservative way to view? Is that true, first of all? Like, do you really think it's true that your grandparents, your great-grandparents, they're just like these evil, immoral, irredeemable people, and you're like so much better than them? I think for the most part, many of us pale in comparison to the people who came before us, you know. I think almost entirely, to be honest with you. But, you know, consider that, you know, what he just described is true. Yes, it's a very liberal vision of U.S. history, but also ask yourself, who have you heard that from the most recently? It's not even so much the leftists or left-wingers, because they still think that this place is evil. They think they're not done transforming this country. That liberal take on U.S. history actually comes the most from who? Conservative figures. Take that into account. Consider that.
Really what these people think. The point of all this being that we have to decide what we want to believe, and we have to decide who we want to believe. It should set off alarm bells in your head that you're not allowed to dispute that this man was a hero. It should set off alarm bells in your head that when you see the left, the communists, Black Lives Matter, all of these people who you know are your enemies, you see them celebrating this person, and you're like, no, they're not celebrating him in the right way. Fools, a lot of them. Maybe you're the fool. Maybe you need to understand that it's a tug of war. It is a zero-sum game. And if they can keep you stationed at, well, yes, of course, MLK was a hero and the civil rights movement was justified, eventually your grip will slip over the course of new generations and new psyops because you refuse to push back. You want to slowly keep giving these people ground, and they'll just keep marching down the field. Like, that's why we lose. We buy into their framework because we're afraid. That's what the George Floyd conservative is about. It's making fun of the fact that these types of people 30 years from now are going to be doing the same thing with Black Lives Matter and with people like George Floyd. Well, Black Lives Matter was about peace. George Floyd, he was the real conservative. He was in support of Austrian economics like me. He was a martyr for the cause of ending the Federal Reserve because he used a counterfeit 20 to make the point that there's really no difference in value.
We actually will, though. That's the blackpilling part. But anyways, I'm gonna skip ahead. You can watch you guys can watch the whole video if you want, you know, on your own stuff. But I'm gonna skip ahead because this basically is just summarizing, you know, the failures of the conservative movement, the way we think is stupid and dumb. I do want to get to like this part over here talking about this stuff. So let's see.
But typically the cycle of these leftist movements is that they succeed, and then upon taking power, they write the history books such that they depict this very appealing narrative of everyone just woke up one day and realized that people were being picked on, and they spoke truth to power, and they led a movement, and the good guys won. And this is what you see with feminism. It's what you see with the civil rights movement, with the LGBT movement. It's all the same. But of course, that's never what happens. It's always a group of activists who have the backing of the institutions. Martin Luther King had the backing of the media. He had the backing of the universities. He had the backing of the elites for reasons we'll get into. He had the backing of the cultural elites and celebrities for reasons we'll get into. And he had the complete backing of the federal government.
Sounds very familiar.
And without that, there's absolutely no way he would have succeeded.
Sounds very familiar.
Possible. And it's the same thing nowadays. Nothing ever changes. I'm going to show you this clip right now to give you kind of an idea of how true that is. Here's a clip from 1972 where a woman named Angela Davis addresses an audience to talk about a case where a 24-year-old black woman named Emily Butler, who worked for the IRS one day, decided to go out to her car and get a gun and then come back and murder her white supervisor in cold blood. And I'll explain why this is significant afterwards, but take a look at this and listen very closely to what she's saying.
You heard about the case of Emily Butler? It's a very tragic case. Because when we talk about racism and the black worker, we have to look try to understand what's been happening with the Emily Butlers. She's the sister who worked at the Atlanta Internal Revenue Service Bureau. And as she had mentioned on many occasions prior to the charges being lodged against her, she felt that she was a particular target of the racism, the institutionalized racism, in the sense that she never got promoted whenever times for promotion came around. Whenever she made a request, her request was always denied. And when it came to just outright, blatant, overt racist harassment, she had to deal with that every single day, every day she went to work. And you see, one day, she asked to see her doctor, and they told her no. And then they started screaming at her that she had punched in her time card 2 minutes late. And then the white 4 men and 4 women really began to get on her back. And the sister became so desperate that she didn't know what to do. And she went and got a gun and she shot 2 women. But you see, let's try to understand what was happening in that situation. Because that's certainly not the answer to liberation. I mean, we got hundreds of thousands of Emily Butlers.
Notice how they clapped.
And we have to realize that Emily Butler is not guilty. It is racism that pulled that trigger. Racism.
They clapped. They're like, whoa, optics check. But no, you got that right. They literally clapped when this woman got up here and talked about how Emily Butler killed her coworkers, right? So I think the important thing to also take from this is, if you're struggling to understand this whole like MLK thing, right? I think it's important to understand that nowhere along the line was this whole movement really that moderate, right? There's a sort of perception that like, well, back then it all made sense, but now it's gone too far. Now BLM and all these organizations are very, very radical. I think they're too crazy now. You look back, I mean, this footage is in black and white, okay, and they're saying arguably even crazier things, or at least on the same level that you hear from BLM today. They're literally saying that at what Emily Butler did, it was justified, right? She literally like felt like she was being treated unfairly at work, and then she went and shot people because of it. And they're out here saying she's not guilty, right? So this is very I mean, this is arguably like more radical than all of these like police these whole instances of police brutality and stuff. I mean, they're out here saying like, this person who just got angry and shot people, racism pulled that trigger, but just keep in mind, this stuff isn't new, and it really it really wasn't as moderate back then as you seem to think it was. There's not like this point where it's just like, now the left has gone too far. They always believe this stuff, and they always thought this stuff.
Anybody needs to be indicted and imprisoned. It's the reincarnation of racism himself, Richard Nixon.
And very familiar too, right? What do they say about the Republican presidential candidate / Republican president who's like appealing to conservative, the face of racism himself, Richard Nixon? Just people don't get it. Trump and Nixon are very. Some people don't always understand why. Like I actually like somewhat like Nixon, right? I don't agree with every like policy piece, but I think it's important to understand what Nixon in the scheme of history really represents, and maybe part of the reason why the 1960 election things went the way they did and whatnot. It's interesting to consider.
Did you notice how the audience started clapping after she said that she shot the woman in cold blood? Like they had to be shushed because they started clapping.
Yeah,
and she also
that's
says,
their logic.
It is racism that pulled that trigger. What a sentence. There was literally there's no better sentence to describe the politics of Black America than it is racism that pulled that trigger. You can't write this stuff. Like you watch that clip from 50 years ago and it sounds like it was recorded yesterday. How many stories do we see now? Well, you don't see them, but they still happen, of Black people assaulting white people or even killing white people and then claiming afterwards that it was because of racism, as if that's like a justification. And what's the response to it? Well, they got what they deserved. That's what you get, which is a lot like how this audience claps here when they hear that this Black woman murdered this white woman in cold blood. So maybe nothing ever changes. maybe black people have basically just been using racism as an excuse for their behavior, which is why they pledge allegiance to the left. The essence of left-wing political thought is the abdication of responsibility. It's never your fault. It's always something else. You're always a victim. You're always oppressed. It's always a poor environment.
Should we speed this up more?
And so even when all the policies that the left has passed in the last 60 years have put black Americans in an even worse position than they were 60 years ago, they still don't care. And they will still block vote for Democrats because their culture would rather blame racism than address its own problems. And I dare you to tell me that I'm wrong. And what's the answer to this from the right? Well, the left is actually being racist when they tell you that you need help to succeed because it's the soft bigotry of low expectations. Okay, but then what happens? They're still not succeeding.
The conservative mainstream does acknowledge this part, I will say.
It's because of white people and racism. Vote secured. And I did a whole hour-long this video dissertation, whatever, debunking the idea of systemic racism, everything from slavery leading to poverty, to poor education leading to poverty, to police and judicial bias, everything. There's a ton of research. It's airtight. But no one wants to have an honest conversation about this. And it's a tired point, but it's true because there's a bunch of black people in this audience who agree. But guess what happens when they try to bring this stuff up? Oh, you're an Uncle Tom. Oh, you're acting white. They literally get casted out. Like, I know that there are some leftists in Beverly Hills, California who take issue with this. But when you go to public school 15 minutes outside of Detroit, you learn a couple things. And one of the things you learn is that black kids who want to pay attention in class, take advanced classes, do their homework, study for tests, they get told that they're acting white. And other black kids won't hang out with them. There were black girls in my high school who weren't allowed to say the N-word because they acted white, which it's honestly kind of funny, but it's true. And it's a problem and no one wants to talk about it. I used to work at a Subway back in high school and I worked with a woman who would take the bus up Woodward to get to the store. And for those unfamiliar,
whoa. Confirmed. Wait. What did he say?
Talk about it. I used to work at a Subway back in high school.
He says, "Oh, this is underhanded."
I worked with a woman who would take the bus up Woodward to get to the store.
He says, "Oh, I worked with a woman," and he literally shows a video of Badan. Confirmed. Nathaniel Abbott, transgender. We all knew, It was just it was sus all along. He would talk a lot about masculinity and deadlifting and all this stuff, and he's secretly a woman. He's secretly a woman. Wow, what did he mean by this?
Those unfamiliar, there's a road in Michigan called Woodward that runs from Detroit northwest up until Pontiac.
Yes.
And so she would take the bus from the city to work at our store, and then one day she bought a car, and then a couple months later her car got stolen when it was parked at her apartment or something. And so she comes into work and she tells my boss about it, she tells me about it, and my boss said something like, "Damn, that really sucks, just unlucky, I guess." And she said, no, they did that intentionally because they were mad that I got a car. They were like targeting her intentionally because they didn't want her to succeed. And at the time, I thought she was just being paranoid. But I don't know. Maybe she was right because every time I talk to black people about this stuff, I hear stories like this. But then when I talk to white liberals who think that they understand black culture because they went to a private school that had 2 black kids who, for all intents and purposes, acted like white kids and who, read the new Jim Crow in their social studies class, they tell me all the approved talking points. That it's not their fault. It's because of different forms of institutional racism. It's the same way that during the civil rights movement, they were able to win the support of white people in the north and in the suburbs by showing them the footage of police spraying hoses at these activists. And they thought, oh, these poor people, they're just being targeted for no reason. And it was the people in the South who actually lived alongside them who were saying, well, it's a little bit more complicated than that. And we see the same thing now. It's always the white liberals who live in the least black areas, who live in the gated communities, who live on the coasts, who go to these private schools. These are the people who tell us that they understand black culture. And everything I just said is actually racist. Really? Because I have black friends, and I have for my whole life. Racists always say they have black friends. Maybe because they're not actually
just me, or just thing flickering.
Bitch. How could a racist have friends that they hate? What kind of low standard are you setting for these people who are apparently oppressing everybody who doesn't look like them? Isn't the quintessential example of American racism for you people segregation? Where white people were separate from black people, and now when white people are friends with black people, you're like, that's the same. That's what racist people do too. And you can believe these things simultaneously because you are incapable of penetrating thought, and the collective contents of your brain have been decided for you by think tanks. But I spent hours every weekend of my childhood in the neighborhoods of Detroit doing work in the churches for as long as I can remember. Not downtown, not the University District, the parts that look like a war zone.
Chandler Crump, my best black friend. Shout out Chandler Crump.
Still, neighborhoods hollowed out. Still, but I'm the racist because I don't buy into the narratives that the people who live in all white neighborhoods promote, and who operate within the coalition that has destroyed basically every major city.
Noah Boyd says black and white photography is racist and colorful photography is gay. So I don't know. Is this supposed to be a suggestion that the modern state of photography is basically a psyop? I don't know. But I will say, I would never start recording my content in black and white because it's just not how content is done nowadays. It just wouldn't be good. But I will say, things did work kind of cool back when they were all in black and white. There's something about the aesthetic, and maybe it's just a vintage aesthetic to us now, so we don't really notice. I don't know. Or maybe there really is science behind the colors and I don't know what it does to our brain, whatever. But black and white stuff was quite epic. I think honestly, things back in the day when that was the thing, arguably were kind of epic. I think that is true. I think that is actually very true.
So I don't know. Maybe as a LARP, we need to just bring back black and white things, and it'll just make the country better. True.
That's the institutionalized racism, the institution that had federal troops poking white high school students with bayonets to enforce the policies of the civil rights movement, which is all just to say that, like, they clearly can't define institutionalized racism now. Well, they couldn't define it then either. And just like they pretend that they're speaking truth to power now, despite having all the power on their side, they had it back then too. They had the federal government throughout all the 1960s, and that was all it took. We're going to get into more detail with that in a second, but I'm just trying to kind of illustrate to you the parallels so we can understand that this is just history repeating itself. And if we want to solve these problems, then we have to stop making the same mistakes, which means we have to stop taking these people at their word. Again, stop listening to communists.
True.
That woman was a communist, by the way, Angela Davis. Here's how this connects to Martin Luther King. Angela Davis had teamed up with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference during the Emily Butler trials to try to rally public support for this woman. And of course, Martin Luther King was the first president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. He was there when it was established. It was effectively his organization, so to speak.
Sure.
Like, when you heard SCLC, you thought MLK and vice versa. And so when Angela Davis announced that she was teaming up with Martin Luther King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference to get justice for Emily Butler, she delivered this announcement at Martin Luther King's old church in Atlanta, Georgia. And during this announcement, she said that the fight to free Emily Butler is a fight to form a society in which we ourselves are at the helm. What does the word helm mean? Where are my pirates? To be at the helm of something means to be in control of it. That's what the goal has always been. Angela Davis was a member of the Communist Party. The goal was never equality or representation or whatever. It was, is, and always will be control. Because the only way to construct a society that lets people literally get away with murder because of racism, be given endless amounts of cash and opportunities and whatever else, all because of racism, the only way to have that would be to control it. Because otherwise, the people in that society would just say, well, I'm sorry, but we're a meritocracy. We like our freedom. These things aren't just going to fly here. The point being that there's a reason that these people were communists, and there's a reason that all of their arguments are divorced from reality, and it's that their goals aren't actually what they say they are. And if there's one thing that you take away from all of this, is that you never listen to a communist or anyone who is sympathetic or adjacent to communists, like ever. This should be self-evident. And the point of all of this is to kind of begin to honestly examine the true legacy of Martin Luther King.
Dude, it's so true too, because you have so many mainstream conservative movements and organizations and figures and stuff. They do say things along the lines of, imagine being a socialist, cancel socialism. Socialism sucks. This, that. Their whole basically identity is being anti-communist and anti-socialist. But then at the same time, every MLK day, it's like, MLK this, MLK that. And it's like, do they see, isn't there kind of an irony there? Is there not? I mean, MLK was a self-proclaimed socialist. I mean, he was an open socialist. He did not proclaim himself to be a communist per se, but I think you can kind of see what he really believed in terms of that, And I think the reason why he didn't really say he was a communist is because kind of I guess the mainstream perception of communism at the time was sort of like Stalinism, right? Because think this is the early 60s. But MLK certainly really was and appeared to be a true communist in like the Marxist Trotskyist sense, right? Like that's the type of like sort of like the modern like cultural Marxist, whatever. That's just really like true communism, not so much Stalinism. Stalin was kind of just more like a crazy maniac with like a lot of communist tendencies, but it's just very interesting, is it not? Socialism bad. My entire thing is LARPing against socialism. Socialism sucks. But here's an MLK post every MLK day. It's like, okay.
Like, what does it tell you?
It's weird,
when the
right?
Southern Christian Leadership Conference, his thing, they're allying with an open member of the Communist Party and announcing that partnership in his old church to protest against the imprisonment of a black woman who murdered her white supervisor in cold blood because it isn't
and that's
her
the other
fault,
thing.
and it
The
was because of racism. What does
SCLC,
that tell you? What does it tell you when Ralph Abernathy, the guy who co-founded the Southern
everyone he
Christian
left
Leadership
behind
Conference,
is like
the guy
a hardcore
who was Martin Luther King's mentor,
socialist.
the guy who took over from
But
Martin
he
Luther
was
King after he was
actually a
assassinated.
conservative
What does it
American
tell you when that
patriot,
guy
guys,
is friends with Angela Davis? When he goes to East Germany to deliver speeches on her behalf, and then he comes back and he tells her that he actually likes their model. When Angela Davis, who's at the heart of this movement, who's at the heart of this coalition, when she says that Ralph Abernathy and Martin Luther King taught her that socialism is the answer. What about when Martin Luther King, in one of his last speeches delivered at the Riverside Church, he says that these are revolutionary times. All over the globe, men are revolting against old systems of exploitation and oppression, and out of the wombs of a frail world, new systems of justice and equality are being born. The shirtless and barefoot people of the land are rising up as never before. The people who sat in darkness have seen a green light. We in the West must support these revolutions. What do you think he's talking about there?
Yeah, exactly. What do you think he's talking about? This is the late 60s, right? If it's one of his last speeches, the late 60s. Yeah, what's going on in the world, right? Vietnam, that sound familiar, and then you had, Korea a few years before that, and a lot of like the sort of like color revolutions, socialist revolutions and movements around the world, Cuba, just a few years before, right? All this stuff. And so it's like, what do you think he was referring to? No, but he hated communism. He said that once. Okay. It's like, around the world, like, again, what do you think he's referring to? What was he referring to? It's very interesting because MLK, you could argue, was like a master of optics in many ways, because he I will say that was the one thing he was good at. And I think John makes the point that kind of his entire existence and the reason he was kind of there in the movement was basically to get the support of like white moderates, right? Just moderate white Christian Americans, which at the time in America, due to the demographics, you really needed the support of way more than now, and I think then you can understand. But you really look at what he's saying, it's really not that different from, I don't know, even someone like Joe Biden in 2020, pretending to be this moderate that he clearly wasn't, right? So take this into account. I think this is something that, you got to recognize.
Birds of the same feather, right? Maybe it was calculated that the enshrinement of equality, a term that's almost self-justifying, right? It sounds so splendid, a term that is the backbone of communism, the antithesis of this country and of the free world and of Christianity. Maybe it was calculated that equality could be sold to the American people under the guise of healing racism. And the result would be the total enshrinement of equality as the governing philosophy and religion of the country. And when nothing changed, when the problems were still the same, and when the rhetoric was still the same, it wouldn't even matter because the pieces had already been put into place. Maybe that's why all these civil rights movement leaders had communist ties. Maybe that's why Martin Luther King, who wasn't exceptionally intelligent. Maybe that's why he had Stanley Levinson, one of the major contributors to the American Communist Party. Maybe that's why he had him ghostwrite his I Have a Dream speech. Maybe that's why Martin Luther King said to the board of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in 1967 that the evils of capitalism are as real as the evils of militarism and racism, and that the problems of racial injustice and economic injustice cannot be solved without a radical redistribution of political and economic power. And then we look 50 years later and Black Lives Matter is run by...
but that's not what he meant. That's not what he meant. He owned guns. He was a Republican American patriot. Again, you can try to, first of all, it's like, considering that the left also controls the institutions, even if you want to kind of spin his legacy to be about that, you don't have the power to do that. And so what the left is ultimately going to do is simply just go right at the heart of like, here's who he was. The only effective way to push back on that when you don't have control of the institutions is just basically just to stand up and say that it's wrong. You don't have the power to kind of spin things otherwise. You don't have that type of, we don't have that type of control in this country, even if we wanted to do that, which I don't think would be necessary. I still don't think is something that it would be a good idea. But even if we wanted to do that, we couldn't even do it. It's true.
Open Marxists, and we're like, how could this happen? Because it's all the same goal, and it always has been. And maybe from where you're standing, it just seems like a 60-year streak of bad luck. But the truth is, the game was rigged from the start.
So true.
The point of all,
again, right? Think about this. BLM ran by Marxists. We don't associate with any movement run by a bunch of communists, but except for MLK, right? MLK, even though he's like the same things are all true, it's just like you almost wish, let's just keep the boomer conservative logic for a second and just apply it to MLK. If you just applied their logic that they apply to like all this stuff today to MLK, the boomer would be based on this. Like he would actually get it. But it's just like, for some reason, and we know the reason why, but like for some reason, MLK is just this protected status that we can't apply the logic that like mainstream conservatives apply to everything else. BLM, communist organization, socialism sucks. We don't associate with anything communist except for MLK. If you just continue the logic, all right, I'm not even asking you to, for this, for all intents and purposes right now, you don't even need to like philosophically like change the normie on a deep level. Just have them apply it to MLK. It's not actually that difficult. But, like I said, the problem is that MLK is on this deity status, and that's what makes it all hard, isn't it?
All this is just to kind of illustrate the foundations for what Martin Luther King's legacy would actually become, to show how it was totally destined to follow the path that it has. There was no point where they just took it too far, or, well, they aren't following his teachings correctly. No, this was always the point, which we'll continue to elaborate on as we continue. But the last thing that's important to recognize in terms of the parallels is how these movements have to invent their own martyrs. They're rallying to the defense of a Black woman who killed her white supervisor in cold blood, saying she didn't do anything wrong, and that the real problem is actually racism. Fast forward 50 years, what do we have now? We have Black Lives Matter rallying around Michael Brown, who they say didn't do anything wrong. The real problem was racism, right? Or Trayvon Martin, who again didn't do anything wrong. The real problem, racism. Do you see the pattern? Nothing ever changes. These activists lie, and if you believe them, then you deserve everything that's coming to you. But your children don't, and your grandchildren don't, and I don't. So maybe it's time to stop believing them. Now, the last adjacent parallel that I'd like to illustrate before we go through the reality of the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King point by point is pertaining to the race riots in the summer of 1967. This was called
summer
the
of
long, hot
67.
summer because it was a summer of race riots. There were 159 of them that broke out in every major city in the country and dozens more. And adjusting for inflation, these did about $1 billion worth of damage to the country. And there was a presidential commission established called the Kerner Commission after its chair, Otto Kerner, who was the governor of Illinois. And this commission basically sought to diagnose the cause of the riots and figure out how to prevent them from happening in the future. So the first thing to note in this timeline, remember, 1967, Martin Luther King is still alive. Lyndon Johnson's the president. He's more than happy to mobilize the power of the federal government to enforce the victories of the civil rights movement. And we've got the Civil Rights Act. We've got the Voting Rights Act. It's looking really good for these activists, right? But still, these riots break out across the country. They irreparably destroy a bunch of formerly great cities. And then this commission is formed. And after 7 months, they release the report as to what caused the riots and what can be done to prevent them in the future. And you will never guess what they concluded was the cause. Lack of economic opportunity, failed social service programs, police brutality, racism, and whites-oriented media. This was 55 years ago, and it sounds like it was from 2 summers ago. Except now they don't say whites-oriented media; they just say representation. But it all means the same thing. And just like the riots we saw 2 summers ago were blamed on the same things
You could read from
these
something
rioters
today.
didn't face any consequences either, beyond being subdued by the National Guard. No, the report places all of the blame on white people. It literally says,
Exactly.
I'm quoting, that white racism is what was
Mostly
responsible
peaceful.
for the explosive mixture which
not
was
new.
accumulating in our cities. And this really is what cemented what we now just take for granted and don't question, which is that you cannot criticize black people. And if you do, then you deserve whatever happens to you as a result, because virtually anything that black people do that would be condemned as poor behavior by white people is either in response to or because of white people and racism, which are effectively indissoluble according to this narrative. And of course, this leads to questions. You have to ask why cities in the North were burned to the ground when cities in the South, like Birmingham, weren't, despite the fact that conditions for black people in these cities were infinitely worse. Like, it's not even close. Or if the problems were white racism, then why didn't this occur before the civil rights movement had secured so many victories, like say 40 years prior? And why do they still occur 50, 60 years after we've spent all of this time and all of this money following the guidelines as outlined by this commission and by these activists? Why is it? Because this had to be the justification for the restructuring of American society, the destruction.
John Hoke says, long term, we think we need to think more. Long term, we tend to think more plus than we do in the short term. What does that exactly mean? Only banger side. Do you think Project Paperclip led to this commie takeover? I think it's more. I think it's way more complicated than that. It's sort of like the long march through the institutions. It started even like back in like the 20s and 30s. It was really, there's no I actually is kind of an origin to it, but I think it's just something that was kind of happening in academia in these places, for quite a while. And there were a bunch of people in the 50s that tried to expose it. Richard Nixon was one of them. A certain guy whose initials were JM was another one. And what happened to these people? They got taken down. They got silenced. They tried their best, and I think that was kind of when we still had the chance to do so. And and by the time we come around the 60s, right, where just a few liberal presidencies kind of take power for basically about a decade almost. Look how fast, right? Look how fast they just managed to put everything into place. It's true.
Of white racism is ultimately code for the destruction of American society, because the prescriptions for the abolition of racism end up meaning the abolition of true meritocracy, of freedom of speech, of national sovereignty and borders, of a true market-based economy, of the American dream, of property rights, of the family unit, in essence, the entire country, which they don't even try to hide because they openly say that they hate this country, that they hate its systems, that they hate its founders, and they want to completely restructure the entire thing from the ground up, starting with the Constitution in the name of this vaguely defined concept of justice,
JFK was not based. JFK is not based. And John is about to explain it for you.
Currently has churned out this cycle.
But
it's not rocket science.
LBJ is his legacy.
Just like when it comes to MLK, all the things he left behind are his legacy. I really don't think that you can say that LBJ was not the legacy of JFK. And there's a reason. Look at the 1960 election. You look at who won there, and some of the things that allegedly may or may not have occurred there. There's a reason why JFK came out on top, I believe. And even further on that, everything that LBJ, I think it's important to understand, everything that LBJ did, JFK supported. Okay, like that was his legacy. Okay, and had JFK not been assassinated, become this big figure, you would see him finish out his presidency probably and do all the same exact things that LBJ did.
If you take this into account.
Everything is the fault of white racism, and since white people are inherently racist and therefore their institutions and systems are inherently racist, they have to be changed. And so every policy will ultimately seek to redistribute wealth, opportunities, resources, enforcement of laws, etc., in a way that negatively affects the society as a whole, but serves the interests of the power in society operating under the guise of justice, with the support of those who believe they've been persecuted and those who sympathize with them because of propaganda. That cannot be overstated. Why do you think that you were taught to idolize MLK? It's the same type of nostalgia that we get for people like JFK, and it's poisonous. Oh, well, JFK would have been a Republican nowadays. Here's this figure that the left has popularized. Well, I'm going to try to play into their framework and see if it'll benefit me.
Okay, here we go.
If you've ever said anything to the effect of, oh, if only Democrats were like Kennedy and Republicans were like Reagan, you have been psyoped, my friend. That's not inherently bad. However, in a serious political discussion, let's not pretend that two incredibly charismatic and handsome presidents who were in office during a time that two generations get respectively nostalgic for are really the gold standard for statesmen in this country. Really? JFK would have been a Republican because he like supported the Second Amendment and wanted to cut taxes. JFK wrote A Nation of Immigrants. He believed America was just an idea that anyone in the world could and should be able to just come and live here. Like, he was totally in support of the civil rights movement. And his legacy is Lyndon Johnson, his vice president, whose legacy is open borders and the civil rights movement. Like, he literally set into motion the final nail in this country's coffin. And you want to talk about history repeating itself? Look up the election of 1960. Look up the weird stuff that went on with those votes. Oh, but JFK would be a conservative now. Now? Yeah, maybe after seeing the consequences of his ideas, maybe after learning that to conserve a nation, you have to conserve the borders that he destroyed.
Sure.
Give me a break. JFK couldn't even conserve the composition of his skull. Boo-hoo. You're going to be unfaithful to a woman as gorgeous as Jackie
John.
Kennedy. Yeah, I'm going to make fun of you. Not
Whoa,
sorry.
you can't say that on YouTube.
Oh, but John, they took him out because of this quote I found where he said he didn't like the CIA or the Federal Reserve or something. You know, every time I hear that, I actually get jealous of him. It's more complicated than that. But anyways, yeah, JFK conservatives. We're all going to be JFK conservatives if we don't get this country turned around. But anyways, the significance of the propaganda conditioning cannot be overstated, because as much as we would like to think otherwise, politics is always personal. And if you've been conditioned to like someone, then you're going to be more supportive of, or at least sympathetic to, the things that they're promoting. And this is why we're taught to idolize MLK, to idolize Rosa Parks, etc. Like, if you look at who high school students are saying are the top 10 heroes in American history, guess who they say? They say Martin Luther King. They say Rosa Parks. They say Harriet Tubman. All figures who serve roles in propping up these narratives that have been so destructive to this country. And that's why high schoolers are taught to be idolizing these figures. Like, what do you think the butterfly effect of that's going to be down the line? So this is why people are going to get emotional, because I'm going after MLK. Are you actually like anti-MLK, my dude? Yikes. Like, this can only surprise you when the contents of your brain have been decided by a think tank. You are incapable of original thought because you're weak. And if the narrative told you to paint your face like a clown, you would do it, because already it's gotten you guys to stick things in yourselves and chop things off. So you're barely alive. Like, there's no effective difference between you and an AI that has read Twitter and Reddit for like 2 hours. Oh, MLK is so good. Oh, Rosa Parks, a communist activist who staged that incident which led to the boycott. Oh, she's so good.
I guarantee you, don't watch it. It's going to be a waste of time if you do. But I guarantee you, when the bread tubers react to this, okay, when actual Jake, when all those like reaction channels to John Doyle, it's very interesting. They're always very interesting looking characters, okay? I didn't say anything bad. I just said that they're interesting looking characters, okay? These interesting looking characters. And everyone's unique. It's so true. I guarantee you, and when it comes up to this part of the video, they're all gonna see, okay, they're gonna cope too. They're gonna like try to say, "Whoa, John, look at what you look like, this or that." John looks like a very clean Chad, actually, is what he looks like. But like, they're just gonna have a lot of problems. They're not gonna be very happy. They're gonna see that part of the video because it's personal. It does, I don't know who John was precisely speaking to, but if I were to interpret it, that's probably it really is in many ways a shot at the bread tubers who are going to react to this video. It's very true. It is very, very true. All right. The guy who wears a corn onesie. Okay. It's just the optics of people like that. Here's a guy who's wearing a onesie of a piece of corn, and he looks ridiculous. And I don't know. I think many of them probably have like anime girls like on their backgrounds or something. And here they are like, "Oh, John, look at this guy. He sucks. He's racist. He's not funny." It's the bread tube.
Did she?
Tube,
I want you to guess right now, in case you don't know. You're familiar with the story of Harriet Tubman. Of course you are. Guess how many people she saved. Not saying she's not a hero, just trying to evaluate how much of a hero you have to be in order to be within the regime's top 10 heroes in American history. She saved 70 people. Oh, Harriet Tubman, she saved 70 people that are thrown on the $20 bill because we need every figure in American history to serve our narrative that says that white people are the worst. Yeah, well, white people invented the abolition of slavery, yet we're demonized in countries that we built by people who apparently couldn't do the same in their own countries before coming to ours. When do we get White People Day? We don't even need a month. We just need a day. Like, we tend to be more punctual. Shouldn't be a problem. Like, we're pretty neat, right? Hey, you're going to be in the office tomorrow? No, it's White People Day. Oh, that's right. Got any plans? Yeah, me and the boys, we're going to be headed up north, taking the Bayliner out, maybe do some fishing, maybe get the skis out. Oh, well, hey, be sure to gas up with jerry cans beforehand so you don't have to stop at the marina on the lake because that's how they get you. See,
BreadTube will no longer exist under the totalitarian state of Vince Dow. It's so true. It's so
funny
true.
Because they have to invent these myths and narratives about how white people are just evil and just constantly, relentlessly, incessantly shove them down everybody's throats because otherwise people would just look at white people and be like,
it's factually true.
Yeah,
it's very true.
Goofy, but they mostly just keep to themselves. And it's the exact opposite with everyone else, with every other group who's oppressed. They use the language of oppression to allude to these images of slavery, right? Slavery in this country. And yet they include people who were never enslaved under the same umbrella. It's like a Trojan horse that is painted in the blood of black slaves. But if it weren't for this vague historical narrative of oppression surrounding all of these groups of people, oh, they've been through so much. Oh, we just have to feel so bad for them. Then people would probably just look at them and be like, why are they acting like that? That's not normal behavior. Like, please just stop. But they don't. This is what propaganda does. This is what conditioning does. And speaking of conditioning, let us now clear up the historiography of the civil rights movements and of MLK. So like we said earlier,
right, here we
criticisms of Martin Luther King actually disprove the image that
John Doyle be the average John Doyle video. It's so true. It's so true. Look at this. We are out of a 104. That's a stupid moment by me. Out of a 1 hour, 4 minute long video, we're gonna start actually talking about the topic of the video. 51 minutes in. 51 minutes in. It's a true talent.
Always portrayed
so
as. Whereas, again, it's not like Washington didn't actually lead the Continental Army. So the first thing to understand is that effectively the leader of Black America before Martin Luther King was Jackie Robinson, who, of course, was a very popular baseball player, played for the Dodgers when they were still in Brooklyn. And he would later become heavily involved with the civil rights movement. And he would team up with Martin Luther King and his Southern Christian Leadership Conference. But the thing about Jackie Robinson is that he was first and foremost a baseball player, right? Like, that's what he liked to do. That's what he was good at. And so there needed to be somebody who could fit the role, right? And that's really important to understand because people like to forget that Martin Luther King did not become a leader, or he did not ascend to leadership, so to speak, but rather he was cast as that. Because remember, they're trying to elevate and enshrine equality as effectively the new religion and governing philosophy of the United States, but you're still dealing with a country that's like 90% white and Christian. So it's like, how do you do that? You have to speak to them in a language that they understand, which is where Martin Luther King comes into play, because they needed someone who was relatively biblically literate so they could use Christian language to appeal to white America and sell them on these ideas. Yep. And also because the church has always been influential in Black America and America in general too, but there were a few other Black leaders within the Southern church.
Actually, maybe after the video we can go over that. But
Martin Luther King was good because he more or less got along with everybody, which not only would make things run more smoothly, but it would also reduce the chances of someone trying to attack him or bring him down in the future, which of course would hurt the movement as a whole. And so the other thing that cannot be overstated is that the civil rights movement had the complete backing of the institutions. They had the backing of the elites, the elite universities, the media, tons of figures from the popular culture, and most importantly, the federal government. Like both Nixon and Kennedy were running in 1960 on a platform of being pro-civil rights movements. And both of them maintained a good relationship with Martin Luther King. And here's another thing that should ring a bell for you. JFK used to do fundraisers to raise money for the bail of people who would get arrested for rioting and looting at these peaceful demonstrations. And by that point, the Department of Justice...
It's true. Jesus Christ fan did cover that.
Martin Luther King wanted. And the counterpoints to this are always as follows. One, this vague idea, this eternal and vague idea of American racism, systemic racism, etc. Two, that J. Edgar Hoover was using his FBI to spy on MLK and his associates. And three, that he was assassinated. And because of these points, we're supposed to just believe that MLK was this dissenting voice. He was a threat to the establishment. So we've already covered why the systemic racism thing is stupid. But with Hoover's FBI, I actually agree that this was a violation of privacy, but nothing came of it. Nothing was going to come of it, at least in the short run. And the idea behind it was that they had to spy on Martin Luther King because of his rumored ties and sympathies to communism, which turned out to be true. But I doubt that this stuff would have been leaked to the public at a point where it would have mattered. And it ended up actually being Martin Luther King's associates who would spill the beans on his degeneracy after he died, that he was cheating on his wife with all sorts of different women, many of them prostitutes, etc. He watched and laughed while one of his associates...
Moral character, leader of morality, guys.
I'm just telling you the truth here. Yeah. But the point is that J. Edgar Hoover being paranoid and just spamming the wiretaps, that's not really enough to outweigh the overwhelming and universal support that MLK had from the power in this country, I don't think. And then for the assassination, we'll address that at the end. But yeah, Martin Luther King...
I think there's also something to be said that, he may have even faced a little bit of opposition from some areas of the government, understanding that like the full-scale institutional control that the left had back in the 60s was really just starting to set into place, right? And so I'm sure there's still probably actors within our institutions, within the government, whatnot, who, would have kind of been against him and maybe less so, maybe more so than it is now. But I think, it's obviously still true that, like, for the most part, the poll skill control, was definitely on their side of the institutions probably by this time.
King knew that he depended on the federal government to accomplish anything, since they were the entity that had the authority and the power to actually enforce these things nationwide.
I'm 5'7".
By that point,
I'm 5'7".
the federal government was like completely.
And this has
willing
been
to serve
verified
as the
by
enforcement
medical
for the civil
experts.
rights
All right.
movement. And they utilized the media in a way that rings bells for us too, because they would intentionally get arrested at these demonstrations to draw national attention. Because even though there was crime in the southern cities, they were able to win over support in the north and in the suburbs, where there were the least amount of black people, because they would just see this footage on television.
Sounds so familiar.
We were all shown in classrooms when we were kids.
Sounds just like 2020, doesn't it?
Peaceful protesters were being picked on, no reason at all. And that's so important to understand too. These protests and peaceful marches were devolving into riots, just like how we see now. I've gone to these demonstrations before, and everyone shows up and they'll do a peaceful march. Everything goes fine. It's after the march, when the crowd is still there, that's when things get tricky. And so the emphasis that we're all reminded King put on peace and nonviolence, it was all good branding, it was all good optics, but it rarely
so true. Like I said, great optics.
Earlier, there was a growing black power movement, there was a growing black nationalist movement, and these people had given up on nonviolence. I mean, they had given up on including white people. They would give speeches where they would talk about killing whitey. Malcolm X would give press conferences where he would straight up tell people, yeah, you should start killing white police officers. And because of this existing concurrently, it was very important for Martin Luther King to stress nonviolence, because remember, he's trying to sell this movement to white America, and they're getting anxious about all this kill whitey rhetoric. And so we had to just keep reminding people that they did not support violence. And that's because King correctly understood that he would need the support of white people to achieve the power necessary to implement the goals of the movement.
Hey, sound very familiar, right? Sound very familiar. Of course it does. But this is basically, I drew the parallel earlier. I'll even just say Joe Biden, because I drew the parallel earlier to, Joe Biden's inauguration speech was this whole thing about unity, but that's obviously not his legacy. So why do you say that MLK's one speech about "I have a dream" is his legacy? Well, I guess we could do the same thing. We could draw the same analogy here. It's like, how did Joe Biden kind of treat BLM in 2020, right? Was there really any serious disavowal of violence or the rioting or whatever? No, really, what there really was kind of a rewriting of exactly what BLM was, and just to say it is peaceful. Look at how peaceful we are, this or that, and kind of tone down the rhetoric, tone down the cause. It's just like all BLM is about is that we, black people just want to stop being, targeted and killed and harassed by the police. And it's like, it's obviously much, much more complicated than that. It's obviously not really what it's about at its core, but it's like, do you see how the same type of branding, the same type of optics, same type of strategy on many levels, but we could even relate it directly to the Biden 2020 campaign in its relation to BLM, just as an example. You see how little things really do change. It's true.
But the problem was that towards the end of the decade, Martin Luther King was losing lots of public support because of the rioting in the cities, and also
is a religion of peace
against the Vietnam War, which, like all anti-war rhetoric from the left, was because of communist sympathies.
So without
this is why we're always scratching our heads. We're like,
office,
the left used to be anti-war, and now they're pro-war. Hypocrites. And it's like, bud, listen up there, guy. Anti-war was always about pro-communism, because the communist activists wanted communism to spread throughout the world. And this is not to take a stance on the Vietnam War or the domino theory or anything like that. It's just to correctly point out the motivations behind these demonstrations. Like, the useful idiots are always going to believe that the true cause is whatever is printed on the poster, but it's never that simple, of course. Moreover, towards the end of the decade, he had transitioned a lot of his rhetoric from anti-racism.
Do you remember? I forgot her. I always forget her name, but there's a very prominent female journalist, liberal female journalist back in the Vietnam War, who literally went to North Vietnam, and lived with the North Vietnamese communists for I think 9 months or something like that, and came back with this whole documentary expose on how actually the North Vietnamese are, very nice people, and all this stuff. And it's like, was that really ever just we're just against American intervention? If you're against American intervention, how often do you see, I don't know, conservatives? Do you see, well, I don't know, maybe conservatives do it too, to an extent, but it's just how often do you really see it that, if we're just anti-war, then the case is, American intervention. Oftentimes the kind of conservative talking point, I should say it like this, oftentimes the conservative talking point when it comes to, and maybe this is wrong, I think maybe this is flawed, maybe we shouldn't be doing it like this, but, the conservative talking point usually when it comes to being anti-war, kind of the nationalist view, kind of the America First take, is really that, it's not necessarily that we feel one way or the other about this government, or even maybe we think this government is bad on a personal level. It's just about the fact that America shouldn't be intervening. It's not our business, Americanism, not globalism, this or that, right?
On the other hand, when it came to like the Vietnam War protests, it wasn't really just about, well, we just don't think this should be the role of the American military, and we disagree with this implementation of American foreign policy on the world stage. It was just open, sympathy for the communists, right? That's what was kind of the center of the 1960s, whole movement. And you have a freaking journalist, a very prominent journal. I don't remember her name. If anyone can like bring up her name, please let me know. Very prominent female celebrity figure in America goes to North Vietnam for 9 months and basically tries to paint this whole image of them being very nice people, very cool people. Is that really like, is this, and now at this point, are we really going so much anti-war, or is it simply the fact that we really do want communism to spread, right? Notice a difference in how like us as modern day, national conservatives approach the anti-war issue versus the way they did back then, right? I think it's very
rhetoric
different.
to anti-inequality in general, meaning in terms of economics and wealth, things like that, anti-poverty. And there was an anti-poverty march planned for the summer of 1968 that was predicted to be a total failure, that was predicted to end up
Hanoi Jane.
Riot.
Okay,
by that time,
Jane
by the time
Fonda,
it would occur,
correct.
MLK had already been assassinated. But to summarize, by the end of his life, Martin Luther King was in support of reparations for Black Americans. He was in support of affirmative action.
But then this is what you get, right? MLK wouldn't have supported reparations or affirmative action, but he did. It's not even a matter of speculation. He literally did support those things, But that's not really in consistency with his "I Have a Dream" speech, and so there's no way he could have supported that, or like any other political or social figure. Sometimes you give speeches that don't really tell the whole story in terms of what you mean or how you feel, and it's like there's more to you than what you say in one speech,
He was in support of changing the federal government to essentially redistribute wealth and non-white.
And this is the problem. Whenever we debate with the left, debating with the left, I know it's stupid to begin with, but whenever we debate with them on these issues, whenever we just try to revert back to this is not MLK's vision, it's very easy to debunk that because it is MLK's vision. You know what I mean? It's very easy. So that's a big reason why I say like we cannot continue to just ride this. The MLK was not about that when he was, because every time that idea really has to stand up to the test of just legitimacy, it's going to collapse because it's just not true.
Americans. And the whole anti-poverty march that was planned for the summer of 1968, it was about exactly that. It was rooted in identity politics against white Americans, and it was going to levy all of these demands against them. And that's why it's not enough to say, oh, well, but King said there was work to be done in the Black community. Yeah, remember, he was trying to sell these ideas to white America, so he couldn't just say everything out loud, right? Like he had to dress it up like,
right.
Well, we just want equality, and then don't you worry, we're going to take care of the rest. But of course, it's never that simple.
Right.
He was also in support of racial quotas in the workforce. Basically, anything that you can think of in terms of the racialist policies that we see now, he would have gone on to support.
MLK wouldn't support racial quotas because he said you should be judged by the content of your character, but he did support them. It's like, why don't you just like stop taking his most optical speech at face value? And then you also notice like how like pre-civil right, before the 1964 Civil Rights Act was passed, yeah, you're right. You did get the more optical MLK. Once they got that in the door, notice how immediately they're just pushing harder. But it's like, no, MLK never did that because I just know all about this one speech. It was a patriotic speech, bro. Or you can just, but then also they're like, facts don't care about your feelings. Your feeling about MLK is not fact, buddy. It's not, okay? And my feelings do care more about your facts, but I also have the facts in this instance. I do. And you're just wrong on all the levels here, okay?
100%. And we know that not only because of the rhetoric and the actions, but because of all of his proteges, all of his successors doing exactly that. But he never got to that point because he was assassinated. And as a result of that, he's now seen as a martyr for the cause of civil rights. And every person in this country is told as a child that he was killed by a racist white guy because he was a hero fighting for good against a racist country. And this is the key to his story. And because the left can only function if they believe that they're in a perpetual state of revolution, they have to believe that he was killed by the power that they were fighting against, either because it was the power of white racism through a lone gunman, or it was the power of white racism occupying the FBI or the CIA or something that put the hit out on him. This is not the case. No, it's true that MLK was killed by power in this country, but it wasn't power that he was working against. It was power that he was working for. Because towards the end of his life, he was losing standing in the civil rights movement. His public popularity was declining. He began flirting with elements of black nationalism and black power. In his 1968 Summer March, that was setting up to be a disaster. And so a calculation was made, because the only thing more compelling than a revolutionary in the eyes of the public is a martyr. And so it was probably calculated that it would be better to take out MLK and cement him as a martyr for the religion of equality for the rest of time than it would be to basically let him fade away.
Interesting theory.
Movement and of the public. Because without the assassination, he wouldn't have a legacy. And I guarantee you he wouldn't have a holiday. he would have become someone like Al
Yep.
Sharpton or Jesse Jackson. Like eventually the information about the scandals would have gone public, his infidelity, his communist ties, his plagiarism. But now, because he was assassinated, nobody cares about that, because the story goes that he died fighting for equality and he was killed by a racist white man. Like that cancels out any and all criticism. Like literally BU admitted that he plagiarized his dissertation, but they still said that they weren't going to do anything about it. So in terms of the legacy of Martin Luther King, being assassinated was like the best thing that could have happened to him, which I am sure he would disagree with. I'm not happy that he died at all, by the way, not only because it's immoral, obviously, but because I know that that was done to cement his legacy in American history as something that you cannot contest and that you cannot question. But yeah, like he would have become someone infinitely less important, like Jesse Jackson, who was one of his proteges. And he wasn't at all opposed to identity politics. Like Jesse Jackson's Rainbow Coalition, meaning not white coalition throughout the 70s and 80s, that was just the direct successor of Martin Luther King's work. And just like Jesse Jackson is a direct successor, Black Lives Matter is the indirect successor. You could not demonstrate a meaningful difference between Black Lives Matter and the civil rights movement. And I'm serious about that. Like the end goals, the tactics, the narratives, and ethos, it's all more or less the same. And the only differences would be minor things like Black Lives Matter is led by women instead of male preachers who needed to be male preachers in order to appeal to white America. So if it weren't for Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement, we wouldn't have Black Lives Matter. We would not have affirmative action. We would not have the levels of anti-white racism that we do now, certainly not within the predominant culture. You wouldn't have the restructuring of history to put non-white people at the center of it while minimizing the accomplishments of white people and demonizing them simultaneously, et cetera, et cetera. And you can thank the civil rights movement for that. You can thank the civil rights movement for the disasters that are now American cities. Go ahead. Ask your grandparents how nice it used to be to go into the city, to use public transportation, to use public facilities. They'll tell you. Conservatives, because they are addicted to losing, will say, well, the cities are bad because of Democrat policies and public transportation is bad and public facilities are bad because the gosh darn government, they can't do anything right. No, it's a bit more complicated than that. My experience at the post office, the United States Post Office, is a lot smoother in Democrat-run Vermont than it is in Democrat-run St. Louis. You can tell me why. And again, this is not to say that the activists did not have some legitimate grievances. It's not to say that we should just Control Z this whole thing. It's just to point out that it is historically illiterate to celebrate something that has enshrined the riverbeds for the further destruction of our country. Like, who's better off because of this? No one. No one. No one is better off because of this. They're actually much worse off because of this, particularly Black America. And it seems that the only people who've benefited from this are the people who orchestrated this whole thing in the first place, which are the people who pull the strings in the society. And just like they selectively apply the standards to punish American heroes like George Washington, they selectively apply the standards to ignore plagiarism, the serial adultery, the ghostwritten speeches.
The conservatives do it too.
In their portrayal of Martin
The
Luther
mainstream
King,
ones, at least.
their narrative. Martin Luther King could not have done anything without their help. He did not write his speeches. He couldn't have done anything without the support of the press, of the universities, of the elites, etc. Does that ring a bell? What have we been saying? Nothing ever changes and history repeats, and we will continue to lose so long as we continue to take these people at their word, buy into their moral frameworks, and somehow think that we can like outsmart them in doing so. It's impossible. Sorry, but Martin Luther King is a false idol. His legacy sucks. And everyone in this country is worse off because of his efforts, especially the people who he claimed to advocate for and who supported him the most. Because it turns out that you can't actually trust people who make money denigrating and selling out the American people to advance the betterment of the country or its people.
So true.
Hey guys, if you like this video, leave it a thumbs up, leave it a comment.
It is so true. It is so true. We've made it to the end. We've made it to the end, folks. Great video. All right, great video. Now I guess I'll take over from this point. We'll talk a little bit more about it, and then we'll go to Q&A or whatever. But let's check chat real quick. Let's check chat real quick. The same people who call the left hypocrites will use MLK words about equal treatment to discount anything else he said that goes against it. Right? Exactly. You know. I think and honestly, I think the Joe Biden analogy is perfect. Okay, the one I kind of came up with, because, you know, it's framed in a way that I think every conservative can get it. They're like, Joe Biden talk about unity, but he not about unity. Okay, apply that same thing, right? Same rhetoric, same deal here. And it's referencing something that you like 100% certainly understand, and applying it to, you know, maybe something that's, I guess, harder to understand. Then you got it, right? Then you got it. But anyways, what I do want to talk about really quickly is because, you know, we talked a little about, you know, heretic. Let me see if I can find it. You know, we did talk about the fact that, you know, MLK's, even his Christianity, which is, I think, something that the right often, you know, kind of celebrates or whatever. I believe this is the source. If I'm looking at this correctly, I think I remember this to be the source. Yeah, exactly. All right. Can we not, please? Okay. Okay, cool. Really? Wow. Can you just stop? Can you just let me read? They're trying to read this thing on stream, please. All right, excuse me. But anyways, I believe this was the source I looked at, and this is something that is, you know, let me see if I can find it. Okay. Yeah, I believe this is the source I was looking at. All right. Well, evangelicals and Southern Baptists in particular, and yeah, the Southern Baptist one is very important, because it's just like, obviously as kind of like this optical move to prove that like we're not racist, they try to bring in, and really just to please the world, I would argue. Okay. And this is not a huge whole scale criticism of the Southern Baptist Church. I think I generally like them a lot, in many regards. But, I think there is definitely the Southern Baptist push to kind of use MLK, because MLK, I don't think was a Southern Baptist, or maybe he was he? I don't know. He was a Baptist, and he was like a Baptist from the South. I don't know if he was part of the Southern Baptist Church specifically, but there's this push to kind of, I would argue, to please the world by like embracing MLK as like this Christian figure, and I think it's the same type of thing conservatives do. But, I think that's very dangerous, because if you as a church are going to be like embracing a figure like this, I think it's very important that you recognize, how Christian really was their lifestyle and whatnot. Because, there have been a lot of scandals in terms of like Protestant, pastors and stuff. I think posthumous ones. What was it? Which one was it? Is it Billy Graham? Like, there's one of these. I remember there's one of like these big Protestant Baptist like televangelists that was all, he was very liked in his day, and then it turned out after he died that he was like a huge adulterer or whatever, and he had a lot of sexual scandals in his private life. And they canceled him for that. Like the kind of Baptist circles canceled him for that. And it's like, if you're going to do that with, was it Billy Graham? If I'm getting that right, am I thinking correctly here? I don't remember exactly which one it was. It's one of those like legendary sort of like televangelists, whatever. Okay, if you're going to do that for him, I think it's fair you do the same thing about MLK. I mean, MLK lived a very, very bad, personal life. It wasn't just that, he drank a little bit too much sometimes. He had a little bit, he hooked up with girls before he got married in college or whatever. No. This was a guy who was like, he was an ultimate adulterer on his wife, and he did a lot of crazy things and allegedly enabled rape, and maybe even was a rapist himself, a lot. So it's just like, and even on top of that, like even his Christian theology, it certainly was not Baptist. It wasn't even like Christian, And so I think it's very important, when the Southern Baptist circles or whatever say, try to like please the world by like, hey, look, we're like MLK too. I know you think we're like the racist conservative church. We're actually not. I think it's pretty relevant to ask, how was MLK really even the Christian that we think he is? And that's really not true in a lot of ways. Let's see. So, anyways, 2 years ago, the Southern Baptist Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission held a joint conference with the Gospel Coalition on the 50th anniversary of MLK's assassination. The conference, dubbed MLK 50, featured several social justice pastors from evangelical churches and the social gospel movements around the country to celebrate MLK's legacy. Further, professors at Southern Baptist seminaries are defending King's heresy as well. And it's like, what are you doing? What are you doing, Southern Baptists? I mean, you're like supposed to be the most based Protestant church that there is, and you're doing this. All right. And I'm sure it's much worse in other churches. The Southern Baptist Church is like one of the better Protestant churches, but it's just like, like, what are you guys doing here? Anyway, so he was a pastor at King Memorial Baptist Church until 1960. But anyway, so yeah, he actually used to be a pastor, right? And so let's look at the things he taught as a pastor, and it's like, okay. In 1959, on Easter Sunday, King preached a sermon titled A Walk Through the Holy Land. This sermon calls into question King's biblical fidelity and his commitment to essential Christian doctrines. In this sermon, King denied the importance of believing in the physical resurrection of Jesus, stating that it doesn't matter if one believes in the physical resurrection or a spiritual resurrection. And it's like, no, it was a physical resurrection. The Bible is quite clear on this. Jesus literally proves that it's a physical resurrection, right, to his disciples when he's like, look at my hand, feel that, right? And this is heresy. This is straight up heresy to say. So it's just like, why is the Southern Baptist Church promoting this guy? And really, I mean, read into this. This right here is not as bad as today's progressive churches, necessarily, churches, quote unquote, because you get a lot of like stuff today, where it's something along the lines of, because I've seen some of these progressive sermons and stuff. I'm not even going to call it a church or Christian, but you know what I mean, right? And it's just like, namaste, they try to do this whole universalist, like all religions really say the same thing type of thing. It's not about believing in Jesus. It's about like self-liberation or whatever,
this right here, arguably not as bad as the modern progressive churches, you know, whatever, but you can definitely see where this is coming from. This is not really all that different from like the woke churches you see today. And it's just like, you know, it's not just his politics that were left wing, even his like Christianity. The one thing that conservative Christians do say, hey, we do have MLK on this. You really don't. You really don't. He really is not that different from, you know, the progressive Christians or whatever that I think you definitely see today. So, you know, this is the quote. He tried to synthesize the Greek doctrine of immortality of the soul with the Jewish Hebrew doctrine of resurrection, this or that. And it's basically, you know, what he's basically saying here is that like Paul is just trying to write a story here. It's like, no, Paul was not just writing a novel or whatever. And that's not what the Bible is. The Bible is basically, you know, historical account of what happened. That's what the books of Paul are. And you're being a heretic by saying this, you know, but it's just like, you know, so let us continue. Attempting to pit the Apostle Paul against the Hebrew writers of the Old Testament. Hey, this sound familiar? Isn't this something woke Christians try to do a lot too? Paul, a king asserts that Paul tried to synthesize Greek philosophy with Greek philosophy with the Hebrew doctrine of this or that, right? And this is just heresy. Paul wasn't trying to synthesize anything. He's writing he's writing the accounts of, you know, number one, right, the historical accounts of the life of Jesus, but also, you know, his personal accounts of, you know, building up the early Christian church. Like, that's all this is. You know, it's not philosophy or whatever. This is just simply our faith. You know, that's all there is to it. Is the exact Gnostic heresy that Paul is refuting in 1 Corinthians 15 by calling of the first importance, right? So right here, for I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the scriptures, and that he appeared. Right, exactly. Okay. Notice that Paul doesn't say it isn't important. Instead, Paul says of the first importance, it is an essential doctrine, and that is so true. Believing in the physical resurrection, you know, it's not a metaphor. He didn't appear as like a ghostly or whatever. No, it's the essential doctrine of Christianity. And King denied that, but we have the Southern Baptist Church, who again, for the most part, is very good at keeping out this type of stuff. Is, you know, just propping this guy up because he was King was a Baptist, quote unquote, as well. You know. So he also denied the Orthodox view of the divinity of Jesus, right? So the Orthodox and this was in 1929, but he never recanted this, you know. And yeah, I guess you can repent privately or whatever, but let's be honest, if you're going to spread heresy publicly, I think there needs to be a public moment of repentance too, lest you not be just leading people to hell with this stuff. But you know, I think it's pretty obvious that I think it's fair to assume, I should say, that there was not a moment of repentance here. But anyways, the Orthodox attempt to explain the divinity of Jesus in terms of an inherent metaphysical substance within him seems to me quite inadequate. To say that the Christ, whose living example of living we are bid to follow, is divine in an ontological sense, is actually harmful and detrimental. To invest this Christ with such supernatural qualities makes me rejoinder. Well, had he had a better chance for that kind of life that we can possibly have. In other words, one could easily use this as a means to hide behind his failures. Christ didn't have failures. Hide behind his failure. Really? Okay. So anyway, so the Orthodox view that the divinity of Christ is, in my mind, is quite readily denied. All right. While many evangelicals argue that King only held these views in his early years and suggests we have no reason to believe he still held these views in his later years, the fact remains that there's no evidence whatsoever that he recanted these views. So true. In fact, King was given over to the social gospel, a false gospel that places the emphasis of Christ's works on social temporal issues rather than the eternal. Further, his fruits of sexual immorality, like I talked about earlier, place further evidence on the lack of regeneration by the Holy Spirit. And I think that is true. So should evangelicals be lauding King as a Christian hero? Short answer, no. Long answer, no. It's so true. It's so true. Okay, so just wanted to bring that up. So anyways. So, you know, we'll wrap up the MLK thing and we'll go to Q&A or whatever. But, you know, in conclusion here, folks, you know, and actually, before everyone leaves, be sure to like and subscribe. And if you're new to the channel, you found this because of John Doyle, you're a Doyle head, you're a fan of Doyle, be sure to subscribe to this channel as well. We are a Doyle head approved channel. Okay, John Doyle endorses Vince Dow nationalism. This is so true. But, you know, in conclusion here, folks, you know, I like, number one, let me say, I don't think that there is an angle to which conservatives really gain anything out of enabling and supporting the sort of like false idolization, the false deification of Martin Luther King Jr. when it comes to, you know, really our political, like, what good does it actually do us, you know? Because whenever you try to bring up these talking points about MLK, they're easily refuted by the truth, whether that he was a Christian or he would have been a conservative today, or he would have disagreed with the modern left. Like, none of those things are true. So I don't think we gain anything in like trying to lie about him, trying to like paint this different image of him, but it easily falls apart. I would argue even the image we paint of him arguably still enables the left in many ways. So let us just be honest by saying that Martin Luther King Jr. was not some like secret conservative. You know, he was a very hard leftist. He's someone who did support at the time and would have supported too all of these social left-wing causes of today and economic causes and all of those things. And, you know, let's just be honest about it. This is a guy who was, if not sympathetic towards communists, I would argue it's pretty obvious he just was a communist, you know? And I like, why is it that we somehow apply these different standards to MLK that wouldn't apply to anyone else? Like, if it wasn't MLK, let's just say, I don't know, it was, I keep bringing up the example of Joe Biden. So let us just say something like this. If Joe Biden had a communist writing his speeches, you know, what would you say about that? If Joe Biden, like we mentioned earlier, you know, and again, we're using Joe Biden because I think it's the really like easy figure we can use to paint this example. If Joe Biden gives one speech about, you know, unity and colorblindness and, you know, content of character and my children and your children, okay, if Joe Biden gave that speech, would you just accept that at face value, not question anything else he did or said? Like, are any of these things true of Joe Biden or any other figure? You know, when Karen Bass was when they were considering making Karen Bass, you know, Joe Biden's vice president, it was what was brought up. What was brought up? It was the fact that she had ties to communists. She was friends with she was part of like a Maoist organization back in the 80s, this and that. And it's like, this is what the conservatives do. This is what conservatives rightly do, which is, you know, anyone with ties to communists or socialists. No. This is ridiculous. This is insane. Except for MLK, like, what's going on here? And it's just like, you know, every second I think that we don't apply those same standards to MLK is every second that the left uses the truth about MLK to push onward toward their goal of the total restructuring of American society. And the only way to really reverse that ultimately is to go back really to I guess I don't even know if necessarily start, but really go back to this figure that is basically used as the justification for all of that restructuring, for all of this left-wing marching, and really consider yourself like, is this something we ought to be doing? You know, maybe rethink it a little bit. All right, maybe rethink it a little bit, you know. And that's obviously not to say that a lot of the issues back then were not to some degree complicated, you know, but it really is to say that MLK is not the guy that, you know, you think he is. Like that's about part of that much is true. I would argue in many ways, you know, this probably was John's, maybe arguably his second most important video, or like third or fourth. I don't know. Maybe like the liberalism, Satanism ones and individualism ones. I actually did not watch those, but I could presume pretty important things were said in them. So maybe I'm sure those compete. But I'd argue this is something that really is you know, one of John's more important videos, because I think you may, like I said, you may even think that this MLK thing is not a big deal, but I think when you kind of understand its implications and its kind of its widespread context and understand like the way in which MLK is being used to justify and it really is the model for what the modern left is doing, then I think you realize how kind of important the issue actually is, and important it is that we really argue against it from the beginning, not just a very late stage, even more radical version of it. You see what I'm saying? And so that much is true. So, you know, there is that. With that said, we're going to go to Q&A, but I'm going to be cutting off the replay here. Okay, folks. So if you're watching on the replay, and you want to watch the whole thing, be sure to become a member. Okay. I'll put this up on the members tab as I do all of our other full length live streams, Q&A included, post chat fun included. So be sure to become a member for that. And again, if you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe. Okay, be sure to give me that subscription, hit the bell. So true. With that being said, guys, hope you have a very good day or night wherever you are. Thank you very much for watching, and God bless. Peace.